Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Matthew Jackson, who is Professor of Economics at Stanford University and an external faculty member of the Santa Fe Institute, and is president of the Game Theory Society. Professor Jackson's research interests include game theory and the study of social and economic networks, on which he has published many articles and the books, two books, The Human Network and Social and Economic Networks. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Gil. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with one of your older papers entitled Networks of Military Alliances, Wars, and International Trade. You say we investigate the role of networks of alliances in preventing multilateral interstate wars. You say you first show that in the absence of international trade, no network alliances is peaceful and stable. And then you also show that international trade induces peaceful and stable networks. Now, this makes a lot of intuitive sense. Do we have, what's the data that we're using to reach these conclusions?
Yeah, so, the work covers two parts. One is sort of the basic theory behind what you just described, why we need trade and other things to stabilize conflict and eliminate it. And the other is a set of analyses of data. And most of the data that's available on conflict in the world is what's known as the Correlates of War data set. And It's a data set that's been collected for the past, I guess, almost, a little more than 200 years now. So it covers from the Napoleonic Wars through the present, and it covers all kinds of different conflicts. So it can be, major wars like the Second World War, or it could be something small like a dispute over fishing rights where there's, some naval involvement. And so it covers a whole series of different types of conflict.
So because we're looking at wars and conflicts against trade, can we really show causality there with that type of data? Yeah,
no. So I think what the basic data shows, and what you're pointing out is it's hard to get causal inference out of this. So what you see is a lot of conflict just repeated over and over and over from 1815 through about 1950. And then you see a great decrease in it. So if you look at the amount of major conflicts in the world pre-1950 to post-1950, it's dropped by about a factor of 10. And this isn't a situation where we have like a controlled experiment where we have one world where we have trade and another world where we don't have trade, and then we compare them. So we can't do a controlled experiment to tell, whether that's the causal reason for this. But what we can do is take a very close look at when countries begin to trade, and then when there are conflicts, and how that correlates with who has what kind of military power, what kind of trade alliances are there, how much trade is going on, how many trade partners people have, when conflicts occur, and so forth. And so a really careful statistical analysis can at least show us that having a lot of trade predicts that you're going to have a more peaceful world. But we can't be sure that that's the reason for it.
So I guess one way, I don't know if it's in the paper, Matt. So one way is to perhaps look at when wars happen, what the level of trade was between the countries, right? Is that something that we could do?
Yeah, exactly. So there's sort of two main things that predict whether countries go to war. One is how much trade they have together.
Yeah.
And another is whether or not they have a lot of trade partners. So if I trade with a lot of countries, I tend not to go to war much at all. And then there's a second thing. If you and I trade together, we tend not to go to war. And the more we trade, the less likely we are to go to war. So for instance, if in the paper, what we find is if we look at two countries, and if you increase the amount that they trade by one standard deviation, sort of, one average amount in the data, you get a 17 times decrease in the chances that they are going to be at war with each other. So it's a pretty dramatic effect. Like a bump up in trade really makes a huge difference in the drop in conflict. And it makes a lot of sense if we're trading together. The idea of going to war just doesn't make any sense, because we're going to be cutting off our own economy and hurting a lot of our own industries, and conflict is just really dangerous that way. And if we think about what goes on in the European Union, in the last 50 years, it's almost inconceivable that two countries would be at war with each other now. It would be just devastating to their economies. But you go back 100 years, and it was almost constant that they were at war with each other. So it's a dramatic change once you have that trade anchoring. It makes you symbiotic. It makes you really care about what the other country is doing, and even if you look at the U.S. and China, there can be conflict and trade wars in some ways, and a lot of back and forth and bargaining. But the idea of military conflict would really be devastating, and would just be in neither country's interest.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting thing. So, the gains from trade, specialization, competitive advantage, and all of that on the positive side have been very clear. You're pointing out here is that we can also reduce the negative side by, through reducing the probability of a war.
Yes, yeah.
Having a high level of trade, right?
Yeah. And I think when if you look at things like the Middle East conflict these days, it's something that when you look at it from an economic perspective, you think, look, you can try and write treaties all you want, but until all those countries are trading with each other, they don't really have each other's interests aligned, right, or in mind when they're making decisions. And I think the more you can start to cement trade between countries in the Middle East, eventually you can get to a point where you can sign treaties that are really going to be respected by them. But now it's just sort of a piece of paper that says, okay, look, this at this particular point in time, we're going to try and avoid conflict, but the economics don't really drive it, and it's not very stable. And effectively now it's just a stalemate in terms of military strength. But you could imagine the Middle East erupting in different ways, and that's something that if we really want to solve that in the long term, you really need to get the countries' interests aligned. And they may never agree, religiously or politically, but at least if they're agreeing economically, that cements that relationship.
Right. Yeah. And so this could be a policy instrument, Matt, in terms of, increasing trade to reduce the probability of war. I'm thinking, and I know that you have done some work in this area, I'm thinking about South Asia. Mm-hmm. And since 1950s, India and Pakistan have fought a lot of wars. I don't know how many. And I don't know much about this, but I don't think there is substantial trade between the two countries. At least it used to be before. But there is a lot of trade between India and China now. And so as that trade relationship increases, and these two countries have always been, so sort of against each other, so to speak. Because from a policy perspective, increasing that trade is beneficial, right?
Yes, definitely. And you could imagine also, for instance, if you increase the trade of both India and Pakistan, maybe they won't trade with each other, but if they do both have large trading relationships with China, then China has an interest in making sure that India and Pakistan don't fight each other. Because if they go to war, then whatever they're trading with either of those countries gets harder to get in and out, or there can be disruptions in production and demand, and so that those relationships, even if they're not direct, having strong partners that trade heavily with both can be a means of avoiding conflict. And to some extent, that's what's going on in the Middle East these days. Is you have countries that are trading with both Israel and some of the Arab countries, and that makes it in their interest to make sure that they don't fight each other. But the more you can grow trade of all forms between the partners and with other countries, then it makes it in everybody's interest to avoid that conflict.
Yeah. So little bit cynically, Matt, I wondered, one thing we are seeing is now there are blocs forming, right? So EU is a bloc, UK is departing from it. There is a US-UK alliance. There is a Pacific bloc. And so will we come into a situation that these blocs, when they become sort of self-sufficient, so to speak, have less of an incentive to not go to war against other blocs?
Yeah, I think you're correct in pointing out that as we've moved over time, we're entering a phase where we're starting to move backwards a little bit in terms of the way that globalization is taking place. And for a while, we just saw more integration and more trade. And now we're seeing countries separate themselves and isolate themselves and go into trade wars. And the more we see blocks emerging where there's most of the trade going in within blocks and almost none going across blocks, then you have to rely on military might and fear to deter conflict rather than economic interests and aligned incentives. And I think that then we move into a more dangerous phase. And I think the more that economics is taken into account in long-term politics, where people say, look, we have to really think about these trade relationships not just as current economic drivers, but as long-term political devices for ensuring peace and prosperity, then we get to a healthier view of the world, and hopefully maybe things will move back in the right direction.
Yeah, so free trade is really a strategic instrument, not just economic gains, but really more about overall strategy of keeping peace and doing that at least cost for all countries. So to speak.
Yeah, and it's something that's easy to underappreciate because now after a few decades of relative peace, we tend to forget what the world was like before the Second World War, where we're constantly in turmoil and constantly burning resources and killing people and wasting a lot of the world. And I think that now, as we move into a setting where things get more peaceful, people tend to forget the importance of trade and globalization for avoiding conflict.
Yeah, and the beauty of this also, Matt, when you have very robust trade and you have very internetworked set of nations, you also reduce the probability of a madman, coming to power and unleashing chaos, because the system is so interconnected that the economic stabilizers would kick in rather than the political stabilizers we rely on. It's possible, and we have seen this happening last 10 years, that you could have world leaders who don't really have much of a clue of how the world works.
Right. And I guess, part of it is making sure that that at least their countries are closely tied economically to other countries, and that makes it in at least a lot of their population's interests and the business interests to make sure that that even if you have a crazy leader, they don't do crazy things. It's hard to avoid sometimes, but that's one part that I think is always a a real danger in the world.
Right, right. I want to go into another paper, another fascinating paper, Matt, more recent one entitled The Friendship Paradox and Systematic Biases in Perceptions and Social Norms. So you said the friendship paradox, first noted by Feld in 1991, refers to the fact that on average, people have strictly fewer friends than their friends have. I show that this oversampling of more popular people can lead people to perceive more engagement than exists in the overall population. So, what's happening here is that generally speaking, people gravitate toward those who have more friends or more popular, so to speak. And they, if I understand this correctly, Matt, they make their judgments based on what they see in that limited sample and sort of extend that to the population.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think, normally a lot of our views of the world come from our friends and acquaintances and family. And so we're looking around us and saying our perception of how people behave and what's normal behavior is basically driven by what we see. And, some of that comes through media, and even media distorts this in terms of the who we see. But in terms of just our basic friendships, I think the easiest way to understand it is, let's suppose that there's, a class of kids in school, and there's one kid who's very popular and has 20 friends, and there's another kid who has one friend. Now, if you say, look, I'm one of these kids in the classroom, who's it more likely that I'm friends with? I'm much more likely to be friends. I'm 20 times more likely to be friends with the person who has 20 friends than the person who has one friend. And so that means that person gets seen a lot more often and has a lot more influence in terms of determining people's beliefs. And we often don't account for it. We just sort of think that our friends are a random sample, that they're picked. We do realize that they're going to be limited in terms of the geography and maybe the demographics and so forth. They might be closer to my age and things like that. But we don't realize that they're not just random draws from that population. They tend to be the people who have the most connections. And those people aren't typical people. They behave differently, systematically differently. And that's important to understand.
Yeah, so it also leads to polarization, right, Matt? So, if I'm talking to a group of people or I'm friendly with a group of people, I take their views as universal views. And I tend to accept them because I just take that as an average expectation.
Yeah, I think, there's sort of, as you're pointing out, there's various distortions we have in what we hear. And, if we look at the networks that we're involved in, the connections of friends and so forth, there's the one distortion that these people who are our friends tend to be more popular individuals, and they tend to have a lot more friends than the typical person in the population. And the other is, as you're saying, there's also splits in the network. So it's quite possible that, if you look at, for instance, along political lines these days in the United States, people tend to be friends with people who have the same ideology as themselves. And that happens for a lot of different reasons. It's not just by choice, but also by the fact of where they live and what circumstances they're in and so forth. But you're going to tend to be friends with people who have the same kind of economic background, the same religious tendencies, and all sorts of things. And we realize that. I mean, it's something that's fairly obvious to any human, but it's not something that we often take into account when we're thinking about, what's a normal behavior and what's a normal belief? What does everybody believe? I remember the day where Brexit vote came out, and I was talking with a bunch of friends who were from the UK, and they were all people who would, didn't want Brexit to happen. But they were just simply amazed that other people had a different, that there was that large part of the population that would vote to exit. And it just shows you how separated the populations were and so forth. So, if you're in your own circle, you don't know anybody who has a certain belief. It's hard to believe that even if you see a poll that's accurate, you think, oh, that must be biased. And I think we project our own little worlds too much onto the larger world.
Yeah, as you point out in the paper, it also has a lot of policy implications. For instance, you talk about overestimation of peer consumption of alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs. And so again, you have a very biased sample that you're basing your judgments on as a sort of societal average. You tend to overestimate all of these things,
right?
Well,
I mean, you overestimate some things. So for instance, alcohol consumption. When they look at it, let's take a teenager in a say early high school or middle school, and they're looking at around their friends and trying to decide what should I be doing, what's normal, and they're very heavily peer influenced. The friendship paradox means that most of them are friends with the most popular kids, and so they're going to tend to be overrepresented. And then you look at the consumption, and I guess one of the basic facts is if you look at a kid and kids that have one more friend on average are something like 5 or 6% more likely to have tried drugs and alcohol by the time they become teenagers. And so they're experimenting with these things at earlier ages, doing it at higher levels. And that means that then when kids are looking around to their friends, they're not seeing the quiet ones who are not doing this. They're seeing the most popular ones who are doing it. And that gets amplified these days. When you start thinking about social media and everybody's following or paying attention on whatever it be Instagram or WeChat or, whatever they happen to be posting things on, that effect can be much, much larger there, where the friendship paradox can be really amplified. And so they have an impression that everybody else is doing things at a rate that's much higher than it might be in the actual population. And then that feeds off of itself so that it becomes more likely to happen. And so it's actually an important, I think, factor in understanding why people have distorted perceptions of a lot of behaviors.
Yeah. You have done a lot of work in the networks, human networks, and other type of things. And so, is this is the right way to think about this, Matt? That if I think about a network, the centrality, the people who are more dominant, I don't know if that's the right term, in that network, will drive behavior of that network?
I mean, I think it depends a lot on the context as to both how we want to think about who's the as you're putting dominant, or say, let's think of who's the most influential person or who's the most important person. That can take different forms in different settings. And is it just who can reach the most people or who's seen by the most people, or is it somebody who's a key gatekeeper between different groups who has information that nobody else has? There's different ways to be very influential, but they all depend on networks, and depending on the circumstances, you can think of different ways of measuring who's the most influential and who makes the biggest difference in a society.
Yeah, I wondered, Matt, if you have done any work of this type inside companies. I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was at a pharmaceutical company, a large pharmaceutical company, we looked at, sort of the networks inside the company. And, kind of the typical network analysis, you find, people who are very highly connected with others in the company. But curiously, we found that the people who have most influence in the organization are not those who are highly connected, at least cosmetically, in a network analysis. I don't know if you've seen this elsewhere, or if that
yes,
makes
certainly.
Sense.
So actually, there's a number of studies that people have done in going into companies and mapping out, first of all, what's sort of the official relationship of who reports to whom or who's in communication with whom, and then what's the actual communication network, and that can be very different. And then, as you're pointing out, just looking. So one naive thing that we often do is just judge people by how well connected they are. So if you're on Twitter and you have more followers, that must be better. But what's really important, like think about Twitter, for instance. If you tweet, it's not just that first set of people that you're tweeting to, it's the retweets and so forth that make a big difference. And so it's not just how many followers you have, but if you have followers that have a lot of followers, that can be more important. Having a few followers who have lots of followers can be more important than having lots of followers yourself. And right. And so, it multiplies out that way. And so, we've done studies. We did a study in India and Karnataka on trying to get information about a microfinance program out. And there we found that the kind of centrality that really matters is not just this raw number of people, but it's how well connected your friends are and so forth, out to about a distance of 3. So you can actually sort of map out how far out you have to go to really measure this. And that, that can identify very different people than you would get by just counting friends.
Right. Yeah. So sort of the pyramidal structure, or how much it's sort of multiplying out as you go forward. But it's also, as you say, whether your network, the people that you are connected with, are really engaged, right? So going back to the Twitter example, you may have only 1,000 followers, but if those 1,000 followers are really engaged, looking at everything that you do and retweeting and all of that, that is much more powerful network than perhaps, having 10,000 followers who might not even look at most
exactly. So it's a combination of their engagement and their own networks in terms of how much they can reach once they do get engaged, right? And so you want to sort of, if you want to be influential in some sort of social media, you want to both reach people, but you want to reach people who can reach others and get them excited about what you're doing or what you have to say. And it's that combination that's important, not just, reaching lots of people.
Right. Matt, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk more about a couple of your recent papers.
Thanks, Gil.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. Matt, we were talking about human networks, how they form, how different they could be, the quality of networks, biases people might take away from networks by observing maybe biased samples in networks and so on. You have another paper that came out recently, using gossips to spread information, theory and evidence from 2 randomized controlled trials. You ask, can we identify highly central individuals in a network without collecting network data, simply by asking community members? So you ran these experiments in India?
Yes.
So how did that go?
Yeah, it's the basic idea was, as we were talking about earlier, how do you get information out? And there's a lot of programs in the world where you want to make sure that people are participating. So getting vaccinated, or in this case, it was microcredit programs and a vaccination trial. So there were different things that we were trying to get people to participate in, and often they're going to be responsive to hearing it from friends, family, or other people. And so you want to disseminate that information through the network. And the question is, how do you find who's the right person? How do you find those central people that are well connected and so forth? And if you have a map of the network and you can see the engagement and so forth, you can identify those people who not only have, are well connected in terms of numbers of friends, but are well connected in terms of having friends that have friends and so forth.
Yeah.
But the hard part is if we just walk into a place, if I go to Stanford and I want to find that and I don't have that network, how do I find who the right people are in different departments to spread information about something? Yeah. And so that was what we were after in that. And
So if a survey, so you're asking, I guess, a sample of the community, right?
right.
And so what are the specific questions in the survey?
Yeah, I mean, so what we would do is we'd go in and ask people, look, we're here. We want to spread information about a new program. Who should we talk to? Who do you think would be a good person for spreading that information?
Yeah.
And it's sort of interesting because, we could ask who's really central in terms of a network. It turns out that if you ask people, suppose I give you a pencil and paper, and I tell you, look, I want you to draw the network of people around you. So I want you to, first of all, put yourself at the middle and then draw links to all of the friends that you have. And then I want you to also put further links out to who their friends are and tell me which of your friends are friends with each other and so forth. So I want you to draw that. It turns out people are really bad at doing that. They get their own friends. You can sort of name who your own friends are, but figuring out who's, which of them are actually friends with each other and then who their friends are past you and so forth. It's remarkably remarkable how bad people are at doing that. And so one thing we were thinking about is if we go into the village, how are we going to be able to, if we just ask people who's central, how are they going to know that? Yeah. But it turns out that knowing who's central in the village can be very different than being able to draw out the network. Right? So they don't have to be able to draw the network to figure out who's the person that's going to be able to reach the most people directly or indirectly.
Right.
And part of it is just that, the kind of theory that we have about why it works is you're constantly hearing things about people. And, we call it gossip, right? I mean, you're hearing things good or bad about other individuals. And for news to reach you from somebody, it has to be that there's a connection that gets to you from those people. And the people who are able to reach the most people are going to be the people that are known to the most people through the network. And so actually just asking people, it turns out they do a remarkably good job at picking out the most central and the best broadcasters of information in their communities.
Right. And I would imagine the network by which a bad news travels would be quite different from good news network.
Yeah. Actually, so that's something we haven't tested. So we've been doing it just about particular, good news kinds of things. But you're right. It could be that the kind of network you want to spread one type of information could be very different from the type of network that you want to spread different types of information. And some people might be better at spreading new rumors. Other people might be better at spreading, good advice. And those people could be very different.
Yeah, I mean, the problem there is good news follows laws of physics. Bad news can travel faster than light.
Yes. Indeed.
We did something similar, the pharmaceutical company that I mentioned. So one question we asked inside the company to sort of identify the highest influencing people is the question that, if you have a doubt about, in this case, it's some sort of a scientific question. If you have a doubt, not a specialized scientific question, but a general doubt, who do you go first to, ask about that? And you can see, if you just count the frequency of that people mentioned, and they're not high up in the organization, in the organizational hierarchy, you can pick them out. But in the network hierarchy, they are highly prominent.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's interesting because I think as you're pointing out, there can be two things that are sort of going on at the same time. One is how well connected these people are and how many people they reach, but there's also some level of trust in whether this is a person that you would go to, for particular kinds of information. There was actually a study I did with some psychologists at Stanford, Jamil Zaki and part of his group, and we found that people's networks, we were asking two different types of questions. Who would you go out with, to have fun, to party, to make you feel good? And then who do you go to when you have a real problem that you want to confide in? And those networks, that second network, is much less dense, as fewer people that you would talk to, and that network has many fewer links and connections in it overall. And but it also has a completely different set of people who are central, right? So the people who are central in one, tend to be outgoing and sort of extroverted people, and then the other tend to be empathetic, and often less central in sort of the good news network. So you can imagine, these are very different types of things that you're looking for, and the people you turn to could have very different characteristics in different situations.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this has some real policy implications here in a very topical sense, right? So to get to herd immunity, the world has to get 5.56 billion people vaccinated. And there is a lot of information and misinformation out there about vaccinations and other things. And so one larger question, and I don't know, if it's WHO or other organizations, would be to figure out how to get the word out in the most efficient fashion, right?
Right. I think, there's, vaccination's a particularly interesting example, since there have been, historically, various forms of misinformation and disinformation that have circulated, and there are, in some particular situations, when people have strong allergies, or there's there can be some particular side effects that are there. So there are some dangers that sometimes get blown out of proportion, and it's a very dangerous situation, because vaccinations are so vital to protecting the whole population, not just the individuals. And so that's a particularly poignant situation, where you not only want to get information out about a program, but you want people to believe in the program, and so that's it's a tricky one. And right now with the coronavirus situation and COVID-19, it's an interesting one, because it's a newer vaccine, so there's less information about it. So people can have doubts about its long-term side effects, and so that makes it even a harder situation than a normal one.
Yeah, and then goes to what you mentioned, trust, right? So in this control trial in India, are there are there heuristics that are generalizable in a situation like this that you could utilize?
Yeah, I mean, what we found was that the most powerful combination was a combination of who you trusted and who you thought was really well connected. And if you got overlaps, so that people would name somebody who they thought that was somebody they could trust and talk to and believe in, that combination with somebody who's well connected in the network dramatically increased the spread of information through the network, and the eventual participation in the vaccination programs that we were working with. And so that's a pretty simple recipe, right? It's not that complex. It's just you're looking for people who are well connected, and well connected in this iterative sense, that they have friends who have friends and so forth, and then also people who have some standing in the population, so that people trust what they say. And that combination of engagement and reach makes a big difference, a significant difference.
Yeah. And so I'm looking at the paper. So 521 villages. So this is a fairly large study. So trust in this context is local trust, right? So if X goes to Y because X trusts Y, that trust is built up over time by a number of transactions between X and Y, I would imagine, right?
Right. And this was a large scale study, as you point out, 521 villages. And this was a study I did with Abhijit Banerjee, Arun Chandrasekhar, and Esther Duflo. And so, getting buy-in from a government and getting able to work with this large a setting was important. But then, as you're pointing out, that one of the useful parts for doing a scientific study like this is that you want to have a pretty good handle on what the networks look like, so that we can measure them as scientists and then see what's happening. And if you do that in small villages in India, then you have a pretty closed setting where they're not interacting that much outside the village. If you try and do that in New York City, it just becomes one giant, network. It's hard to separate out. And so it's a lot easier when you've got separate entities that you can measure and see. And then, those people are spending most of their time inside these smaller worlds. One thing that I found amazing, from our data was how disconnected people can be even inside these small villages, right? So you take, a typical village that we would work with would have on order of 1,000 people, maybe 200 households. A typical household only interacted with 15 other households on a regular basis, right? So even though they're in a village with just a couple hundred households, it wasn't as if they were, knew all of them and were friends with all of them. They could be remarkably ignorant about other households within their, in their own rural village. So there's still even in these small communities, there were strong splits in the network.
Yeah. I don't know much about this, Matt, but it might be that in a remote village in a developing country, we find sort of not disintegrated, but disconnected people. We might find similar things in a large city, right? If you're living on top of a multi-story building, in a condominium type building, perhaps you are not really, you don't have a very big network. We, know the people on the floor and so on. So I wondered if we are, as we look forward into cities becoming bigger and bigger cities, our sort of personal networks, do you see that shrinking?
I think, it's interesting. I think when we look at technology and how it's changing the way people are connected and urbanization, that's a question. If you go back, in sociology, almost a century ago, there was already a question of, as the world urbanizes and people move out of these rural settings where they're, really helping each other. And part of that, when they went to the big city, would that mean that all our networks would disappear? And then, Robert Putnam had a book, Bowling Alone, and a series of studies that seems to suggest that this, that there would be less tight communities in this kind of world. I think when you look overall, the networks evolve, and they evolve in complex ways. And it's not quite as easy as we would imagine to just say that everything's going to disintegrate. It's sort of, you have new connections, you have different kinds of connections. Your connections through your workplace become more important, or your school, or your family. And so there's different types of connections, and technology now means that you can be in pretty constant contact with people who might live at a greater distance from you, but, you're still well connected to. And I think, that's something that's changing, and we don't really have the full understanding of yet what the ultimate, whether people are going to end up being more isolated or more connected.
And what your work points out is that it has to be studied deeply and understood by policymakers as well. Because if you're going to, again, going back to COVID-19, if we want to get the vaccination program implemented to a high level, it will require influencers, reaching the influencers first, designing sort of a program that provides information in a trusting way and so on, right? Without that, all the mechanics is not going to work.
Right. And, there'll be some settings where the mechanics work pretty well, where, you're going into a hospital and it's necessary for the doctors and nurses to be vaccinated and frontline workers and so forth. But then as you get down, as we need to get herd immunity and we need to get, say, 2/3 of the world vaccinated, we have to get to, small remote villages and all kinds of places, in places that don't believe in vaccines, and we have to get them vaccinated. And that, I think, in the longer run, to make sure that the world has immunity, and not just from COVID-19, but from measles and from all kinds of things, and from future pandemics, which we see are probably not going to be as rare as we imagined. That becomes essential, and getting that news out and getting it out in a reliable way, in a trusted way, becomes more vital. And, I think nowadays we're sort of in the wild west of the social media age, where it's possible for people to get news from all kinds of sources, and some are trusted and some aren't, and they can look similar to each other, and it's very difficult for people to sort out.
Yeah, it's information overload. Ironically, maybe we are reaching a point that you need a machine to actually tell you if the news is right or not.
I think that actually one thing I think is sort of dangerous about, as we were talking about, the connections we make and so forth. A lot more of our interactions are now mediated by algorithms that are, parts of social media platforms, and they're not, they're generally designed to serve us and to help us, but they can be designed in ways. For instance, the friendship paradox we were talking about before, social media wants to show you the most popular stuff. And so that you keep then that feeds on itself and makes those people even more popular. And that kind of distortion is sort of built into the way that the programs work.
That's a really interesting thing. So, going back to the friendship paradox, the problem there is you have a biased sample that you're looking at. So you have a biased data. You average it, and you get an expectation, and you say that is the average expectation of the population. And that's where the trouble starts. So do you see there is a way that perhaps social networks could mediate that problem? I
think there's sort of two ways that they can be done, and they're both not easy. So one is just making people more aware of the distortions that are in their lives, and being constantly aware of things. So when I get news, where did that news come from, or where I hear a rumor, how can I trace that back? How can I check whether or not it came from a trusted source? If I see somebody doing something, should I really believe that that's normal behavior and typical of most people? So, educating people on that, and especially, teens and people who are more influenced by their surroundings. And then the second would be actually trying to help people's networks reach out more broadly and be more diverse. And that one I think is even more challenging, because it's hard. If you give people, imagine I'm a social media platform and I give people 5 different things in their news feed, they're going to tend to click on the ones that appeal to them the most, which might already be something from somebody who's their close friend or something, and getting them to click on something that is from somebody that they don't know or don't know as well, which might have information that they haven't already heard or isn't an echo of what they're hearing already. It's harder to get them to like that, or to look at it, or to believe it. And so it's not easy to just diversify these things. I think it's a real challenge.
Yeah. I mean, this might be a long-term issue for social media. So I think that attempts to mediate the problems on social media appears to be very tactical and not that effective, assigning some sort of truth index to information. But there's a more underlying problem, as you're pointing out, which is there is a bias selection problem by the user. And that user is going to continue to become more and more biased over time. Once you start, there is no stopping it at the current process. So the question, I think, for social media is if they can come up with technologies or processes that could reverse that in some way. I don't know if there's an answer.
And I think it's also exacerbated by the fact that the social media are in competition with each other, right? So, if I'm a social media platform and I try to offer people more diverse news feeds and try to get them to look at things that they might not like or might not listen to, and so forth, then they might just go to another site that gives them what they do like. And right. And so it's really hard for any particular platform to start saying, look, we're going to try and deliberately diversify things, and because it's going to lower the engagement. And it's easier just to say, look, we'll give them what they like and what they are going to click on, and we'll have the algorithm just figure out what they're going to click on, and try and present that to them and do more of that. And then there's this feedback effect. And so it's hard to break out of. And the fact that these are, competing with each other makes it even more of a problem.
Right. Yeah, I want to jump into another paper, Matt, which has just came out. Very interesting. The role of referrals in immobility, inequality, and inefficiency in labor markets. You say that we study the consequences of job markets' heavy reliance on referrals. Referrals screen candidates and lead to better matches and increased productivity, but disadvantage job seekers who have few or no connections to employed workers, leading to increased inequality. So we see this all the time, right? People who get jobs are those who are connected with those who have jobs. And so if your initial conditions are not good, you can't really break that. You're sort of in a different bucket, so to speak. But what always puzzled me, Matt, in this context, I had a book in 2009 called Flexibility, where I argued that the way that we think about companies today, people go out and hire employees and so on and so forth, is sort of antiquated, because I argued maybe prematurely that companies won't exist by 2020. But companies do exist. And I thought, it'd be more self-selection to organize a company in the future. In other words, an employee self-select himself and herself to a company, and the company doesn't hire that person. And so there's this problem that you're pointing out here, which is the people who get interviews, so to speak, are already pre-selected because of their connectivity, and the rest get disadvantaged.
Yes, yeah,
right?
and I think that it's easy to underestimate. We all have this idea, which is correct, that connections matter in terms of getting ahead in the world, but it's easy to underestimate how valuable that is. And in that paper with Lucas Bolt and Nicola Morlica, what we do is we investigate the dynamics of this and the implications of it for inequality, and how it can sort of trap groups that, if I don't have many informed employed friends, then I don't get information about jobs, and I don't get opportunities, and then that feeds on itself. And it's a tough situation. And here the social structure really makes a big difference in understanding inequality. And I think that's, I think it's, on the one level, it's fairly obvious because we know that, job connections are important. But on the other level, I think it gives us a very different perspective of what kinds of policies we need to overcome inequality. And it's not just, taxes and we're going to move some money around. It's that we need to overcome these social blockers that are affecting who has those opportunities and who doesn't. And if we don't do that, we're just time after time, we're just going to have to keep, pumping money into these systems and rearranging, redistributing things. And it long term, you have to understand these kinds of, the implications of this to really design good long-term policies.
Yeah, it's a really complex issue. So if it is, let's say, discrimination, then you can show that discrimination is shareholder value destroying policy for a company. So unless the company is suffering from principal agent issues, the manager of the firm will optimize or maximize shareholder value. Discrimination shouldn't exist, or maybe it should go away over time. But this is a slightly different problem, isn't it? The company is actually gaining, or at least it perceives it's gaining, by selecting those who are referred by by those who are already in the company, or those they know are good workers, or whatever the
Right.
case may
Yeah.
be.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So
think that's exactly right. And companies do benefit. So there's a number of studies that have looked at sort of, the productivity of workers and the innovativeness and how long workers stay from the ones that you get hired via connections and the ones you hired via some open application process and interview process. And the ones that you get through the connections tend to have, better performance on a number of different dimensions. And that happens partly because of this fact that we talked about earlier, which is known as homophily, the fact that people tend to be friends with people who look very similar to themselves. So if you go to your best workers and you say, look, I want to hire somebody who's just like you, the easiest way to find somebody just like them is to look at their friends who tend to be very similar to them. And, and what you're looking for in a person isn't necessarily, somebody who's the, most talented at something, but somebody who's going to be willing to work those hours and be reliable and to have certain demographic characteristics in terms of their, the number of hours and the wages they're willing to work for, and whether this is a good job match for them and so forth. And so your existing workers are great ways to find people who are very similar to them. But then it means that, that then firms rely on this, and then you never get outside of that little network, right?
Yeah, it's a bit counterintuitive for me, Matt. In an innovation-driven economy, cloning employees is probably not a good
Right.
thing.
Yeah. No, so yeah. That's definitely so. I guess there's a trade-off here in terms of whether or not I want somebody who is going to be part of an innovative team in terms of developing and so forth. And you could imagine if I'm trying to build a team that's doing things for me, I want a diverse perspective. But if I'm just looking to hire people who are going to show up, do the job, and be reliable, then my own current employees are the best, match in terms of doing that. And so often firms are looking to their own employees, and even when they look for diversity, they'll often go through. They'll find people who look superficially diverse, but might even be very similar to the people that they already have in terms of, say, education and background, and where they went to college or wherever, high school and so forth. And so they rely heavily on these things. But you're right that there is some trade-off in terms of diversity that this has as well. So it has negative effects in terms of that, and it has negative effects in terms of inequality.
Yeah, so you are there in Silicon Valley. I am out here in the Northeast. Do you see a difference? How a Silicon Valley firm thinks, or some investment bank in New York
Not
thinks?
necessarily. I think often take an example of startups, which there's lots of them in the Silicon Valley, and if you're trying to hire a really good coder to do something in particular for your company, you can go out, and it's easy to get lots and lots of people to apply, and who will have credentials in coding in this particular language or whatever it might be. That doesn't guarantee that they're going to be able to do the job for you, right? But if you have a coder who knows exactly what's involved, and you say, look, give me a recommendation of somebody who can do this job, then they're going to find somebody for you that they know exactly what's entailed in this, and have other people that probably were either friends from college or other people that they know who code and can do it for you. And that's true in the Silicon Valley. It's also true in the Northeast. It could be true if I'm, trying to do this at a financial firm, and I want to look for an analyst, and I want to say, look, is there somebody else who could do the same kind of financial analysis you're doing? That's a very particular job, but it's not somebody you can just hire off the street for. And that's true in a lot of different settings. And so I think that firms all over the world rely on this.
Yeah. You have some really interesting policy ideas in the paper too, Matt. One of them, I don't have it in front of me, but rather than very prescriptive affirmative action type policy, What you're suggesting is more market-based policy, right? So if you pool applicants, if I understand this correctly, Matt, and if the firm is selecting at random or something like that, you could still get much better outcomes without any sort of
Yeah, I
prescriptive
mean, part of it
policies.
is what you need to do is break the strength of the network, and so
Yeah,
getting the firms to be hiring even at random from the population will start to break that out. And part of the important aspects of this is that if there is a group that's underrepresented, once they start getting their foot in the door, then that feeds on itself, and they can start giving recommendations to their friends and so forth, and so it can grow outward. And so these things have multiplier effects. So once you start breaking the effect of the network, which can be costly in the short run because now firms are getting worse matches in the short run. But even if they hire people at random, that can propagate itself through the next generations and sort of improve the overall networks and how things are spread through the society and reduce the inequality.
yeah. And as you say, it affects a lot of things, right? Equality, mobility, productivity, and it's a vicious circle. You can break out of it. And so in conclusion, Matt, I don't know whether you can do anything on a kind of a legislative basis, but if you were to think about, some sort of legislative policy change,
But I
what would
think
that be?
there's several things you can do that we sort of point out. One is you want to make the labor markets as frictionless as possible, in the sense that if I do hire somebody and they don't work out, then make it easy for me to hire somebody else, and that allows me to go out and then search for people more generally in the population, and not fear that I'm going to be stuck with somebody forever, just because I hired them and it didn't happen to work out. So part of the reason companies rely on the connections is because they're sure, they have more confidence in the people they're going to hire through that, and they don't want to hire somebody and take a chance on somebody that they might get stuck with for a long time. So that's one thing that can be done. But another thing that can be done is just try to break that information barrier. And the more that we have policies that allow firms to get to know workers out there in the wild, so to speak, either through internships, some subsidized internships where people from the population that don't have connections get a chance to work for a company for a few months. A company gets to know them, they get to know the company. Anything you can do to certify more accurately the value of the skills that the workers have, to make it easier for companies to be able to see people outside of their connections and see and evaluate those workers. So it's really all about that information friction and making it possible for firms to break out of this sort of vicious circle where they're hiring from the same pools and through the same connections.
Yeah. Just one more quick thing, Matt. So we know that the labor market is much more constrained in the EU compared to the US. So it's a lot more difficult to fire an employee in the EU, if I understand their policies correctly. So do you see this problem sort of
Yeah,
exasperated
so it's an
in EU
interesting
countries?
point. Is that there? I think that this suggests that in countries like a lot in the EU that have more restrictions on hiring and firing workers, that's going to make these problems more acute. And that is correct. I think when you look at the employment rates among new college graduates, they tend to be lower in a lot of the countries that have the strictest labor laws, because firms don't want to just hire somebody and take a chance on it, because they might be having to hold that worker for the next 2, 4, 5 years, and that makes it much more dangerous for them to hire these people that they don't have connections to, and so it makes it so it's one way of making sure that things, you've got a safety net there by making sure that people can't be fired, but at the same time it can actually exacerbate the inequality. And so you sort of need
Right.
to balance those two things against each other.
Yeah, I mean, that's the irony. So strict labor laws perhaps perhaps created to to support labor, ultimately, as you say, result in high levels of inequality in society. And once you get there, as you say, once you get there, it's really difficult to reverse it because you are sort of in a vicious
and then it becomes
there,
more
right?
important to somehow allow firms to be able to hire people or to have internships to get to know people in the broader population and to break out of those networks.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much for spending time with me, man.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks, Gil.
Great.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.